This episode is brought to you by my free 3-part video series, FAM 101. Discover how to chart your cycles by tracking the 3 main fertile signs: cervical mucus, basal body temperature, and cervical position, and ultimately develop body literacy by paying attention to your fertile signs. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAM101 to grab your free copy. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAM101. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 213. Welcome to the 213th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I'm excited to share today's episode with you. In today's episode, I thought I would come to you and share a special solo episode all about surviving fertility challenges. I was thinking about this recently. I was reflecting on a lot of the podcast episodes that I've done on this topic, and I'll link in the show notes page to the podcast that came to mind. So over the years, I've interviewed a number of different guests who've provided lots of amazing insights on surviving fertility challenges. And in today's episode, I'll be covering 8 steps to surviving fertility challenges. And as you know, one of the ways to at least to get a better sense of what's happening in your cycles and to get a better handle of what's happening overall, as we'll talk more about as we get into today's episode, is charting your cycles. And so I know that just paying attention to your fertile signs, getting a really good sense of, what your cycle looks like, what your period is like, when you're ovulating in your cycle, how many days of mucus that you have, how long your luteal phase is, whether your basal body temperatures are falling in line. These are some of the basic things that you can do when you chart your cycles using the fertility awareness method, and it'll give you a lot of insight as to what's happening in your cycle and really some clues as to where to look further. So for more information or to see the different programs that I offer, make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/workwithme. So again, that's fertilityfriday.com/workwithme. Now let's jump into today's episode. So as I mentioned earlier, today we'll be talking about surviving fertility challenges, and I'll be sharing 8 steps. And so these are not the only steps, but these are a few things that I think are really important to pay attention to and to keep in mind, especially if you've been trying to conceive for a while and it hasn't been happening. So the first step probably won't come as a surprise. The first thing I think is really important to do is to have yourself fully evaluated by your medical doctor, a fertility specialist, and a functional doctor. And so I purposely indicated more than one practitioner in there to highlight the importance of really focusing on a team approach. And so every different practitioner, every different medical practitioner has a different function, a different role. And so it's really important to know that and to appreciate that there's certain things that your medical doctor and your fertility specialist will be looking for. And there's other things that they won't be looking for. So if you go to a functional doctor, there's certain things that they'll be looking for and they'll be focusing on that are really different than what your medical doctor will be looking at. And it's important to know that all of those roles are really critical and really important in order to assess and determine what's happening with you, especially if you haven't been able to conceive, what's happening with your fertility. So just to kind of put it out there, so, it's really important when you're considering who to go to and, when you're seeking support, which doctor is going to support you in what area. So most of us start this process by going to our regular doctor, so our family physicians, and family physicians are not necessarily specialized in specific areas. So then from there, if there's an additional issue or a challenge, they'll refer you to a specialist. So it's really important if you've been trying to conceive for a while, it is really important just to kind of do your due diligence to make sure to book an appointment with your doctor, book an appointment with your fertility specialist, and have yourself fully evaluated. So this is really important just to identify if there's any actual physical or structural issues at hand, anything that you're not aware of, anything that could potentially be preventing you from conceiving that you really need to know about. And so, I think that's something that most of us will do at the early stages, but it's sometimes hard to know exactly at what point to go. So, information is good. And it really depends on the situation. So the general recommendation is that if you're under 35 years of age and you've been trying to conceive for 12 months or more, then, at that stage, that is when you'll get a referral to a fertility specialist and they'll, investigate you further. If you're over 35, then 6 months is the cutoff point, at which point. But really and truly, you kind of have to look at your individual situation and decide at what stage feels comfortable. So I think it's important to go sooner than later, just in general. And it's just it's like an insurance policy. It's just, you just want to make sure to check everything out, make sure everything's okay. But with that said, I think a lot of women might stop there. So when you go to your medical doctor and they'll do a series of tests. They'll identify if everything's looking good. And many women will find that, they're not conceiving, but their doctors are telling them everything is totally fine. And so that can be really frustrating and challenging because obviously there's some sort of problem, some sort of issue that is underlying or that's there, especially if you've been trying to conceive for quite some time. And it's frustrating to be told that, everything's fine. So I think it's really important to consider in addition to, so, not or, but and. So in addition to your medical doctor, your fertility specialist, I think it's really important to be evaluated by a holistic practitioner. So that could be someone like a naturopath, someone like a functional medicine doctor, or an integrative physician. So this is somebody who specializes in, looking at the root cause. So they're trying to determine what is happening in the body. So then understanding that if there's an issue with fertility, there's often another issue that's contributing to that health-wise. And so if you're able to, run some tests and figure out what the actual root underlying cause is, you may actually have more success in identifying the issue. And especially if you know that you have a specific challenge with your menstrual cycle, if you know you're having specific challenges with your hormones or anything of that nature, it's really important to remember that no one practitioner has all of the answers. All, medical professionals are specialized in specific areas. And I mean, that's why they have to go to school for so long, because there's all these different areas of medicine. And so no one doctor knows all of the areas. So in the same way that if you're having an issue with hearing, you go to your ear doctor to get a hearing test, the same way that if you have like an issue with your teeth, like you've got a toothache and you need to have some dental work done, you go to your dentist, or the same way that if you have a vision problem, you're going to go to your ophthalmologist. It's really important to recognize that if you're having specific issues with your menstrual cycle, with your hormone balance, with certain, like if you actually know that you have an endocrine disorder, like if you have a thyroid disorder, or, if you're struggling with PCOS, it's really important to find a practitioner who specializes in that area in addition to your medical doctor. So like I said, like a functional practitioner, a naturopath, somebody who specializes in a different approach, who can provide you with additional information that could help you to actually address and resolve the problem. So that's number one. So have yourself fully evaluated, but not just by your doctor. So fully evaluated by your doctor, and in addition to that, a functional practitioner, someone who's going to really look at that problem in a different way. So you have more information. All right. So the second step is to have your partner fully evaluated. So to test his sperm. So to have your partner do semen analysis. And so this is something I've talked about on the show, many times. So if you are a regular listener to the show, if you've been listening to the show for a while, you'll know that this is a topic that comes up a lot. And I've had, several episodes where this is specifically the focus. So, just for some statistical information, 40 to 50% of the time when couples are having fertility challenges, the issue is with male factor. So that can be an issue related to sperm count, sperm quality, motility, a combination of the three. And so when you're struggling with, fertility challenges, when you're trying to conceive and it's not happening, it's really natural for us as women to assume that it's our fault because we're the ones that have the visual evidence of pregnancy. We're the ones that carry the pregnancy. And so it's really natural for us to assume that the problem is 100% me. And so that's something that I see time and time again when I'm working with women, when we're, doing the charting the cycles and looking at the cycle, really trying to figure out what's going on. Often, I have to, gently, and sometimes not so gently remind my clients that, that your part of the equation is very important. It's extremely important, but we have a whole other part of the equation that we really need to make sure we look at. So not only is it important to get that testing done, if your partner is willing and open to do that, but it's important in addition to just getting the test done, it's also really important to have a look at those tests and potentially even, get a second opinion. I think it's really important as well. So if you have those tests done through your doctor, a fertility specialist, it's actually really helpful to consider taking those tests and just reviewing it with your functional practitioner as well. Because often, there's a difference you may have the same results, but one practitioner might say, oh, yeah, it's totally fine. And another practitioner might say, actually, that's a little bit on the low side. And there's things that we can do to improve sperm quality. So, I think that just in general, often we think, okay, it's me. I have to get everything tested. I'm the one that's the problem. I'm the one. And this is not about laying blame. This is more just about being aware that statistically speaking, if you have trouble conceiving, half of the time there's an issue with male factor. And so just a few more random statistics, but over the past 50 years, 60 years, there is a lot of very specific research that has been done showing measuring sperm quality, sperm health, sperm counts. And over the years, sperm counts have been declining and sperm quality has been declining. And so it's actually much more common than you might think that your partner, there might be an issue on his side with his sperm quality. And so if that's the case, all of the things that you're doing, all of the supplements that you're taking, all of the things that you're doing, they are important. But really and truly, part of the real kind of behind this evaluation is to really identify the problem. So if you're doing a full evaluation, making sure you're fully evaluated and your partner is fully evaluated, then at least you have more information so you can better identify what the actual problem is and then try to address that. And, one final note on that is that this is something that you're going to want to do early in the game. If you have the ability to do it, it's something you're going to want to do earlier than later. And the reason for that is because if you do identify that there's an issue with sperm take about 3 months or so to fully develop from the initial stage. So although men produce sperm every day, the sperm do take time to actually form. And so any changes that he makes today are going to impact his sperm about 3 months from now. So, it's the last thing you want to find out, where you've been trying to conceive for 1.5 years and all this time you thought it was you. And then finally, when you have his sperm tested, you realize, oh my goodness, there's an issue on his side, to find out that you have another 3 to 6 months waiting time to actually, do things to improve his sperm quality. So that's something to really consider. Okay, so that's number 2, have his sperm tested. All right, so number 3, so this is something I think it's really hard, but this is something that it's something that we all should know. Fertility is a topic that we should learn a lot more about as we're growing up, as we all know. As a listener of the podcast, you know that this is all information we should have had as we were growing up. But number 3 is know that a delay in conception doesn't necessarily mean that you're infertile. I think that's really important because there's a lot of different factors today that, our grandmothers didn't necessarily have to face. And the first part of that is to know what is normal for just a normal, regular, run-of-the-mill person or couple who's trying to conceive. So, without any kind of fertility challenges, the average couple has about a 25% chance of conceiving in any given cycle. So what that means is, on average, your average couple is going to take an average of 4 months conceiving. So that means if you start to try in January, February, March, April, May. So your average couple might conceive by May. And I think that's really shocking to a lot of people, especially because we've been actively avoiding pregnancy. From the majority of us have been actively avoiding pregnancy for years and years and years and years because we were taught that you can get pregnant on every day of your cycle, which isn't even true. But we're taught that we could get pregnant on every day of our cycle. So that really leaves us with the impression that when you start trying, it's going to happen. It has to happen because we've been trying so vigilantly all these years to avoid it. When statistically, each cycle that you have sex in, you have about a 25% chance of conceiving. And that's assuming that there's no issues, no issues with sperm, no health issues. This is just a regular run-of-the-mill person. So it's very possible that, a normal couple that's healthy and, everything is fine, it's actually possible statistically for it to take 6 months for you to conceive and for that to be totally fine and totally normal, which sounds completely the opposite of what we've been taught. So a delay doesn't necessarily mean that you're infertile. There's all kinds of factors that are at play. And so I won't talk at length about hormonal birth control, but what I found when I'm doing my groups, so when I'm working with clients, is that the vast majority of the women that I'm working with have used hormonal contraceptives at one time or another. I have used hormonal contraceptives at one time or another. And so if you are coming off of hormonal contraceptives to conceive, it's even more important to understand how hormonal contraceptives impact your fertility. So what the research tells us is that there is a well-established delay in the return of your normal fertility. So that doesn't mean that there's like some permanent issue, but it means that there is a delay. So whereas a normal couple, like I said, an average healthy couple has about a 25% chance of conceiving in each cycle, which means that it would, on average take about 4 cycles or so to conceive if you're trying. When you've come off of hormonal birth control, it really depends on the type you've come off and how long you've used it. So for instance, if you use the pill for 2 years or more, then it's on average going to take about 8 months to conceive if you've just come off of the pill. So that's twice as long. And so 8 months is an average. So an average means that some women got pregnant like in month 2 and other women got pregnant in month 12 or 13. Now, if you've used a different type of hormonal contraceptive, for instance, like the shot, it can take up to 18 months or more versus the 4 months that it took your average couple. So that's just something to keep in mind because there's a lot of different reasons why it may take a couple longer to conceive. So if you think about if you have an issue with sperm, so you know that there's poor sperm quality, like you have like most of the sperm isn't normal and healthy, for instance, which is really common. So if there's really poor morphology is what it's called when the sperm itself don't look right. So they have like 2 heads or 2 tails or something. So if you have a really poor sperm morphology, if you have a really poor sperm count, then that means that you have a lower percent chance per cycle. So that just means it could take longer. Similarly, if you have a condition that you're aware of, if you have PCOS, for example, and your cycles are not, they're not 28 days, like maybe your average cycle is more like 37 days or 42 days or something like that. Well, that also means that you have fewer chances per year. So if you're cycling every 6 or 7 weeks as opposed to every 4 weeks, well, that means that you're going to have fewer cycles in the year. So fewer times that you're ovulating and fewer opportunities to try to conceive. So then by nature, it's going to take more months to conceive because your cycles are just longer. So, this is just to kind of share a little bit of a perspective on it, which is that, we're often quick to jump to the conclusion that there's something terribly wrong and that, our bodies are broken and that there's nothing we can do. But there's a lot of different situations where it could just take longer. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be doing something or there isn't something you could be doing or addressing. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be working with a practitioner to really identify those underlying factors and try to improve overall the situation. So I definitely think that's something that is necessary and helpful. The challenge with natural protocols and natural treatment options, it doesn't necessarily happen overnight. So kind of in conclusion, point number 3 is that know that a delay in conception doesn't necessarily mean that you are infertile. It could just mean that it's just taking a little bit longer because we have some of these other factors that are playing a role. Okay, so number 4, you knew I was going to get to this point. Number 4 is chart your cycle to identify the best time for conception. So this will come as a surprise to exactly no one who is listening to this podcast. And so, ultimately as a fertility awareness educator and as a woman who's been using fertility awareness for all these years, I just can't, it's such a part of my life now that I can't imagine not having this. So not having this information, not knowing what's going on in my cycle. Because once you start charting and you start to see your patterns and you see, ovulation happen, month after month, cycle after cycle, you start to really get that sense of like, okay, I know what's going on. I know what it looks like when I'm approaching ovulation. I know how to confirm when I have ovulated. I know how my cycles change. I know how my fertile signs change. And what the research tells us is that the majority of women who are trying to conceive actively, the majority of them are not actually timing sex accurately or don't have a really clear and firm understanding of how to identify the fertile window. And so it's interesting. So I've interviewed Dr. Carrie Hampton on 2 separate occasions. And so she talked about this because she actually conducted research specifically in Australia in women who were seeking fertility treatment. So these are women who had been actively trying to conceive in all likelihood for a year or more. And you would think that these women would be the most knowledgeable about their fertility and like how to time sex and all that. But there's a lot of misconceptions that really guide our understanding of our menstrual cycles. And, as I mentioned before, the majority of us have not had an opportunity to really learn about our menstrual cycles because it's not something that's taught in schools. So what we are taught is that our cycles are supposed to be 28 days, and we are taught that ovulation is supposed to happen on day 14. And so very few women ovulate on day 14, like at all. but let alone like every time, every cycle. And so just based on the understanding that we have of our cycles, it's very possible to time sex wrong, like every time, because many women are actually timing sex like based on the day. So they're looking for day 14 on their cycle and they're having sex on day 14 of their cycle, but they're not really paying attention to the other signs. So when you're wanting to use fertility awareness to optimize your chances of conception, one of the hardest parts about that is that you have to kind of throw away the idea that your cycle is predictable and that you're going to ovulate on a certain day of your cycle. And I would encourage you to really not pay attention to the quote unquote day of your cycle. I would encourage you to pay attention to your actual signs of fertility. So I would encourage you to pay really close attention to your cervical mucus. So if this is the absolute first episode of this podcast that you're listening to and you're like, what the heck is cervical mucus? There's lots and lots of episodes where we talk more about that. But essentially, cervical mucus typically looks like one of two ways. It'll look either like creamy white hand lotion, or it'll look like clear, stretchy, kind of like raw egg white. Or you may just have like a sensation of a really slippery sensation when you wipe yourself, when you go to the bathroom. And so that is actually the primary sign of fertility to be paying attention to, especially when you're trying to conceive, because that is what is going to align with your ovulation. So many women will try to time sex based on the day of the month. And many other women will use ovulation predictor kits to try to identify the best time. And so ovulation predictor kits are a good way to kind of triangulate ovulation, but they are best when used in conjunction with your mucus. So not just the kit, because the kit will alert you about 36 hours or so prior to ovulation. And by then, you may have missed several days of mucus. So chart your cycle to identify the best time for sex and really pay attention to what you're seeing in your cycle. Throw away the idea that your cycle is supposed to be a certain length and that you're supposed to ovulate on a certain day. And instead, pay attention to what you're actually seeing. So know that the days that you have cervical mucus are the best days for conception. That is the best time to try. All right, so let's move on to number 5. So, number 5 goes quite neatly with number 6, which is pay attention to your cycle parameters for clues that could help you to get to the bottom of your fertility challenges. So, for many women, once you start to pay attention to your cycles, once you start charting, especially, most of us run out and grab a resource. So, when I first started charting, I ran out and grabbed a copy of Taking Charge of Your Fertility. I grabbed a copy of the Justice User Guide. And so in these books, we get a clear sense of like what a quote unquote normal cycle is supposed to look like. So in all of these books, you'll see a 28-day cycle where you have your period lasts about 5 days. And then, you have about 5-6 days of cervical mucus leading up to ovulation. That happens around day like 15 of the cycle, kind of in the middle. And then you have ovulation. And then afterwards, you have about 12 to 14 days of a luteal phase before your next cycle. So this is basically what we're expecting to see when we start to chart our cycles. We're expecting to see something that looks very much like that picture. But what often happens, especially if you've just started charting after coming off of hormonal birth control, or if you've recently had a baby, or even if you just have some sort of endocrine issue or, gut issue or just something, it just depends, but on the situation, because there's a lot of different reasons. But many of us find that when we start charting our cycles don't really look like that. You might have endless days of mucus. You might have a longer cycle or a shorter cycle. You may have a shorter luteal phase. You may have a longer one. You may have spotting in between. So instead of just having bleeding during your period, you may have bleeding mid-cycle around ovulation. You may have bleeding leading up to your period, in the second half of your cycle. So all of these different observations that we're looking at when you're charting your cycle, all of those give us clues, information as to, what could possibly be going on. And that's why it's really helpful to chart your cycles, because you get additional information that you wouldn't otherwise have. So you can see right there on your chart, your post-ovulatory phase, like the number of days between ovulation and your period, you can see right there if it's long enough. And so for those of you who've been listening to the podcast for a while, you'll already know that your luteal phase has to be a minimum of about, a minimum of say 11 days, maybe 10, but 10's pushing it a little bit. You really want to see your luteal phase 11 days or more. And that's because it actually takes time for the egg to implant. So if your luteal phase is 7 days or 8 days or something like that, you even if there was conception happening, the egg wouldn't be able to implant before you actually start bleeding. And so things like that are things you can easily pick up on your chart. And so that's one of the ways that your chart can be really helpful to help you identify an issue right off the bat, something that you wouldn't necessarily otherwise know. Your charting can also help you to identify, am I ovulating or not? Is ovulation happening? And when is it happening in the cycle, and those types of things. So it's a really good place to start. And I've had many clients just, they find that when they're charting, they start to feel like they're more in control of the process, or at least more involved in the process. Like, instead of feeling like a passive passenger in this whole journey where someone's always telling you what to do and you don't really have any idea what's going on, when you start to chart, you can actually start to take back some of that control, because you can see what's happening. And as you work towards making certain improvements and changes, you can actually see how it affects your cycle. So that's really important. And I mean, of course, that's why I think that charting is a fundamental kind of basic thing that any woman who's actively trying to conceive should at least be aware of, at least aware that it's an option, even for nothing more than just accurate timing. But in addition to that, being able to really just have that additional information, like what if there's something going on in your cycle, that can give you a really, really significant clue as to where to look next. So number 6, so this is kind of shifting to a little bit of a different topic, but finding ways to manage stress. So, I mean, I'm sure that as soon as I say that, it's kind of annoying. Like, you could just see like, oh, great, here we go with the stress thing. But what's interesting is that when you're charting your cycles, you can actually see the impact of stress. So if you experience a stressful event, or even if there's a physical issue that is causing stress in your body, like increasing your cortisol, you can often see how it can change your pre-ovulatory phase. So stress very commonly can delay ovulation, which can cause problems for women who are trying to conceive, especially if you're thinking about your cycle in terms of like, okay, I usually ovulate on day 18, so I'm going to look at day 18. You can have a stressful event and that can delay ovulation. So it can look like you ovulated. You could see mucus, and, you could even have one random high temperature. That often throws my clients off, especially because they might have one randomly high temperature around ovulation, but then it doesn't stay high, and then their mucus comes back. So charting is really important to pay attention to those things so that you can be on top of it and know how to confirm whether or not ovulation actually happened. But it's really important to know how stress can impact your cycle so that you can pay close attention to those signs, so that when it does happen, you don't necessarily freak out like, oh my goodness, why is it different this month? Why is my ovulation later? What's wrong with me? Oftentimes, just having that knowledge of how stress affects the cycle can really help you to interpret the data so that you don't have to worry so much about what's happening. And so for another example, in the luteal phase, you might find that stress can cause spotting. It can shorten luteal phase. Like, there's a lot of different ways that stress can impact the cycle depending on where you are. So it's a little bit different of an effect, whether you're in your pre-ovulatory phase or post-ovulatory phase. But either way, at least if you know and are aware of how stress can impact your cycle, then you can pay close attention to that. So finding ways to manage stress it's an important part of this process. So I've had several episodes of the podcast where I talk about practical ways to manage stress. And so I'll link a couple of those episodes. And for those of you who've been listening to the show for a while, Circle and Bloom sponsored the podcast several years ago. They are no longer a sponsor, but they're a great company that creates visualizations, meditation audio programs so that you can actually listen to them. And many of them will take you through the whole menstrual cycle. So you can actually kind of time what you're listening to where you are in your cycle. But anything that relieves your stress, anything that brings you joy, whether it's just going for a walk with your dog or scheduling a date with your partner, it's just finding ways to manage stress. That's something that's really important, because although it seems kind of trite to talk about stress all the time, what I can say is that, when you start charting your cycle, you can actually see how stress impacts. Like, you can actually physically see it. So you can actually see how important it is to find ways to manage it. And it's not always easy. That's something else that's really important to point out. Like, it's not always easy to find ways to do it, because it can feel like there's another thing that I have to add to my agenda. So in addition to everything else I had to do, now I have to find a way to manage my stress. So I think that it's helpful to kind of think about it and to know that it doesn't have to be something really big or really time consuming. It could be something as simple as, getting a little journal and writing 3 things that you're thankful for each day, or heading up to bed a couple of minutes earlier each night and spending 5 minutes reading your favorite book or something. Like I don't know exactly what it's going to be for you. What is your favorite thing to do or what would reduce your stress? But it's something to think about, because if you can find something that you could do each day that takes 5 minutes or less, that you can just do for yourself, to give yourself a little special time, that's even just that can make a really big difference. So number 7, this is something that I talk about a lot and I've talked about on the podcast quite a few times, but so having sex outside of your fertile window. This is something that is really, really important. It's really easy to lose sight of the big picture, especially when you're going through something as stressful as fertility challenges. And it's something that I talk about all the time. I talk about it in my group programs. I talk about it when I'm doing my one-on-one client work. But, one of the benefits about fertility awareness charting is that it allows you to identify your fertile window. So I always think about it in reverse way. So for instance, when my partner and I were trying to conceive, we knew which days. So there was 5 days in the cycle that were kind of like go time for conception, but the whole rest of the cycle was not. So I always think about women who have no idea about this whole charting thing and have no idea how to identify their charting window, their fertile window. I have heard women tell me that their doctors told them just to have sex between days 8 and 24 or something like that. So, there are women out there that are actively trying, but they're having sex over this week or 2 week period. And every time they have sex, it's a try, it's an active act of trying to conceive. And so one of the benefits and the beauties of fertility awareness is that, when you identify your fertile window, it's often pretty small. It's often smaller than you think. Some women will have mucus for an extended period of time, but others will have maybe 3 days of mucus or maybe 5 days of mucus or maybe even 2 days of mucus. So when you really start to chart your cycles and you start to identify what your fertile window really looks like how many days of mucus you really have, what I find when I'm working with women is once we go through and learn how to chart and how to check for mucus and all those things, the fertile window is often much smaller than they thought. And so that's a good thing in many ways. And the reason why it's a good thing is because then you have fewer days where you have to actively feel like you're trying. So for anyone who has been trying to conceive for a while, you'll recognize that sex can become very, robotic. It can become more like a chore, something that's no longer enjoyable. Before you were trying to conceive, sex was just fun. Sex was just something you did because you were building a connection, because you wanted to, because you were aroused by your partner and you just wanted to have a go. But then when you're trying to conceive, especially the longer that it takes, it becomes this thing and you kind of have to do it on a certain day, even if you don't want to, even if you had a fight with your partner in the morning and you don't really feel like you're in the mood, you're still doing it because you're trying. So having that window of kind of active trying being smaller means not that you can have less sex, but it means that you can actually enjoy sex outside of that window. So what I love about the fertility awareness method, especially when it relates to trying to conceive, is that that there's only a couple of days each cycle, maybe a handful of days each cycle, where there's a chance you could get pregnant. And the rest of the days then are fair game, just for fun sex. Sex that has nothing to do with trying. Sex that couldn't possibly result in a baby. And you can actually take the stress of trying completely off the table for those days. And you can actually have sex completely free of any of that and just, take those days to just enjoy each other and kind of remember why you're doing it in the first place. So that's something that is really, really important because after all, if you're partnered to a male, what can happen is your male partner can start feeling like a sperm donor, right? Not even a person anymore, just like a place to get the sperm from. And so you don't want that. Because at the end of it, what I always say is yes, you want a baby, but you don't just want a baby. You want a baby and you want your happy family, what you pictured. And so it's really important to foster those relationships. And, fertility awareness can really be a way to support that. Because like I said, once you identify that week where, conception is possible, you have 3 other weeks in that cycle where you can have the sex and not have to worry about trying and not have to have that pressure, not have to have that just not have to have that energy around it so you can really enjoy your partner. So I will stop now, but that is number 7. And so the last thing I wanted to say about surviving fertility challenges, this is really important as well. Connect with other women who are also struggling with fertility challenges. So this can be in person or it can be virtually. So this is really important because fertility challenges are very isolating. And one of the topics that comes up a lot when I do the groups is how frustrating it is when you're trying to conceive and everyone's posting their baby pictures on Facebook and everyone's posting their pregnancy announcements. And it seems like everyone is getting pregnant all the time, all around you, because of course that's what you're paying attention to and that's where your focus is. And so it can be really isolating. And it can really feel like you're the only one who's going through it. But once you connect with other women who are in a similar stage, that can really, I think as women, my experience as a woman, my experience doing this work and doing group work, with women in the way that I do, my experience is just that we all want to be around other women who understand what we're going through, who are in a similar stage. So in a completely different scenario, I found that as when I had my son and then my other son came along, it was really helpful to be around women who also had children and who had not just children, but had young children around the same ages as my children, because they really understand what it's like day to day. And in a way that, like, even if you have like a best friend who is not at that stage, your best friend still loves you and is totally supportive and all of that, but they're not at the same stage. So there's certain things that they wouldn't necessarily get in the same way as someone who's actually in the same stage at the same time. So that's, even if you have friends and family that are really, really supportive, if you don't have any women in your life who are also struggling with fertility challenges or who have been trying to conceive for a while or whatever the case may be, that is something really, really important. If you've experienced losses, if you've had miscarriages, whether one or multiple, and you're having a tough time. I mean, in addition to that, of course, it's helpful to seek professional support if you are really struggling. So, seeing a therapist or somebody who can really support you to kind of address a lot of those feelings that are coming up. But outside of that, finding women who are also going through those same challenges and having a place to go when you're having a really rough day where no one's going to judge you and you can just say how you feel without any judgment, without worrying about how it's going to be perceived by anybody else. So you can just express how you feel and it's just normal because you're around women who are experiencing the same thing. That's really, really important. And so it just can't be understated how important it is to have support and also to have the option to be surrounded by women who have gone through something similar and who are in a similar stage to you and who really get it, who've been there and who understand what you're going through in a way that maybe your friends and your family just can't because they're not going through that. And so that brings us to the end. And so just a quick recap on my 8 tips for surviving fertility challenges. So the first one is to have yourself fully evaluated. So by a medical doctor, fertility specialist, and a functional doctor or holistic practitioner. So not just stopping at one practitioner, but really being evaluated by practitioners who specialize in different areas so that you're really getting a full and holistic evaluation. Number 2, have your partner fully evaluated. So make sure that his sperm is tested. Number 3, know that a delay in conception doesn't necessarily mean that you're infertile. Number 4, chart your cycle to determine the best time for conception and really rely on cervical mucus as your primary sign of fertility. Number 5, pay attention to your cycle parameters for clues that could help you to get to the bottom of your fertility challenges. Number 6, find ways to manage stress. Number 7, have sex outside of your fertile window so your partner doesn't feel like a sperm donor. And number 8, connect with other women who are also struggling with fertility challenges. And so that can be in person or virtually. So that is my 8. Like I said, it's not a complete list. There's so many more items that I could add, but I didn't want to keep you here all day today. So that is my list. And I want to hear what you think I missed or what you would add to the list, because I know that there's more to this conversation. So if you're not part of the Fertility Friday Facebook community, make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/community, and I'll post a thread in there. And I want to hear more about what you would add to the list. What do you think is important when you're working through fertility challenges. And if you are there right now or have been there, what has been most helpful for you? And if, to support another woman who's going through a similar challenge, what would you want her to know? Like, what would you want to tell her? So again, fertilityfriday.com/community, and we'll talk more about it in the Facebook group. So if you're looking for the show notes page, as I mentioned, I'm going to link some of my previous episodes specifically related to fertility challenges. You'll find that over at fertilityfriday.com/213, fertilityfriday.com/213. And I just want to thank you for taking the time to listen to today's episode. If you haven't had a chance to download my three-part video series about fertility awareness charting, head over to fertilityfriday.com/BAM101. So earlier this year, I decided to create a 3-part video series to take you through the basics of fertility awareness charting. If you're new to fertility awareness, if you're still kind of learning about the method and you're wanting some resources and some additional information, then make sure to grab your copy of my free video series. And again, that's fertilityfriday.com/BAM, FAM101. And I hope you are enjoying your summer. I know on my end, I've been spending some time visiting friends and family and really enjoying some of this awesome hot weather where I am right now. So I hope that you are also having a wonderful summer and enjoying yourself and having some great family time, friend time, whatever time that you enjoy to do in the summer. I know I like to do outdoor time, and you'll always find me outside basking in the sun. So I hope that you're doing whatever it is that makes you happy to do in the summer. I hope you're enjoying some rest and relaxation. And so I just want to thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen to the show. I really appreciate all of you for supporting the show, for sharing the show with your friends. I hear all the time from women in my Facebook group, my client work, that a friend of theirs recommended the podcast or their practitioner. And so I really appreciate all of you for sharing the show and spreading the word. And at the end of the day, every woman has the right to know exactly how her body and her fertility works. And so this is going to happen one woman at a time. We just have to start making a ruckus and demand better. And the more we do that, and the more women are part of this amazing community that are just really wanting to understand and appreciate our bodies, like the most basic stuff we should have been taught in junior high, the more women that are part of this community and the more that we spread the word and the more that this grows, we'll get there. I really believe it. I believe that we'll get there, and I believe that we will get to the stage where this is just a standard thing that everyone knows, but we still have work to do. So I just want to thank you all for supporting the show and for being part of the movement. And until next time, be well and happy charting.